Psalm 107. It's taken me a long time to even get through the first verse. To give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. That's a hard thing for sometimes for me to believe. Verse 2. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. This many 30 years ago probably, when I was leading music and doing church camps, and I was always the music guy. There was a song set to the New American Standard Bible translation, which says, "Let the redeemed of the Lord say so." Well, the point is, let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Talk about the fact that they are redeemed. Now, on this side of the cross, the redemption, that this idea that we are redeemed, is quite different than it was on that side, on the psalmist side of the cross. On his side of the cross, and he's going to go into the history in a few verses here about how God stepped in, redeemed Israel, took them out of the dire straits, took them out of Egypt. He saved them, okay? For us, we get to talk about a different kind of redemption and a similar kind of redemption. And I want to talk about that for a minute. First of all, let's talk about a similar kind of redemption that we ought to talk about. Aren't there times, and for me, I never recognize these times till I'm well past them. And then in reflection, I realize, God spared me. He saved me. He redeemed me from something that if he hadn't have stepped in, it wouldn't have just been a bad deal. It would have been, it could have been awful. I mean, I am blessed in that part of my story is if God hadn't stepped in, I wouldn't be here. But maybe not in such dramatic ways, but think about your own life. If God hadn't have stepped in, well, maybe you wouldn't have died, but your story would be way, way different if God hadn't intervened. God is, one of his patterns is, he is a redeemer. He is an intervener, which sounds like a German word for Wiener. That would be an intervener schnitzel. But anyway, he is an intervener. He steps in. Now, to redeem something requires the payment of some kind of something. There's always a cost for redemption. And in the day that the psalmist wrote this, it would have had mainly to do, it would have reached back and connected mainly to a slave being freed. For a slave to be freed, there was a price of redemption. And the master set the price. It might be negotiated by, a third party or even by someone else who wanted to purchase the freedom of the slave, but there was always a cost. Some slaves were able to pay that cost themselves and buy their freedom, but not very many in a comparative sense. All right. God, theologically and spiritually, God redeemed us. And you know the price. The price was Jesus's life. The perfect, sinless for the imperfect and sinful. And God apparently didn't hesitate. I don't think you can make too much of that. So when God redeems me on a level not theological, on a level of, I look back and realize, wow, if God hadn't stepped in, that would have gone way, way different and way, way bad. I need to tell about that. We call that our testimony. I've told you about my experience with testimonies, especially when I was a teenager. I had a horribly boring testimony. And so when at campfire time at camp, that's when most testimonies were shared. And I just thought, boy, don't call on me. Please don't call. I don't know. I grew up, I'm a preacher's kid. I never got in any serious trouble. I've never done drugs. I've never drank. I never smoked. I mean, I was Opie Taylor. Boring. Because there were other kids. Well, I was, I was getting drunk and getting high, and I was all of that. And, of course, one aspect of that, if you grew up in those years, you also have had the experience that it's a little bit like when fishermen get together and tell stories about fishing. The phrase is, the first liar doesn't stand a chance. Sometimes that happened around the campfire. But I felt I don't have a testimony. I mean, how would I hold anybody's interest with my story? So I didn't tell it. Didn't have a testimony, I didn't tell it. Well, now there are parts of my story today that I tell when I can because they matter to me. And I think they can touch other people. It's not about me. It's about what God did in my story. Okay. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. How did you come to Jesus? Some people have amazing and dramatic stories of coming to Jesus. Others, like me, I still think how I came to Jesus is kind of a boring story. But when I've told it, there are people that when I have told my boring story, you know what they have told me? Wow, I wish my story was boring like that. This would have been 40 years ago. There was a trend, I call it, in evangelical churches that we should teach people how to give their testimony. I don't think that was a wrong trend at all. I think it was a good trend. That you tell your story. But if you're going to tell your story, you got to think about how you're going to tell your story. My favorite way of telling my story is in the context of friendship. That's when I feel best at it. But I have friends, first meeting, and it's interesting that God grants them opportunity to tell their story with very little background leading up to the telling of it. I think it's because these people truly have the gift of evangelism. However, one of the other trends in the church about that time was discovering your spiritual gifts, and I think that's a good thing to do. I'm not convinced that you can take a test and figure out what your spiritual gift is, but it could help guide you to figuring it out. So I got a whole big deal on that. One of the disadvantages in that trend is that if we, statistically, I've read that only about 15% of Christians have the gift of evangelism. So the rest of us, the other 85%, do not. And, you know, in this church world of know your gift and do your gift, that's a great thing. I want that to happen. Here's the problem. The one gift that if you don't have, then you can decide you're under no obligation to get into this telling the story. And I don't have the gift of evangelism, so I don't need to tell my story. Wrong. For lots of reasons. And a lot of people would point at it and say, how do you know you could bring somebody to Jesus, but you have to tell your story to do that? That's very true. Here's the second reason. I need to tell my story to remind myself of the glory of God and His grace and His work and His intervention, His faithfulness. I got to remind myself of that. And when I tell my story, I can remind myself. It is a way, and maybe one of the best ways I know of, to remind myself of God's goodness and faithfulness. Okay. Let the redeemed of the Lord tell their story. Quick challenge. You don't have to elaborate on your story. It doesn't need to be 35 minutes long. You might think about, pray about, and then work on telling your story so that if you got in an elevator and traveled 20 floors, you could tell it in that period of time. I mean, 3 or 4 minutes. For that to happen, you got to get down to the real basic salient points of the story. Who I was and how I was, when I turned to Jesus, and what difference has that made? For me, in a way, I have my before story. It's real boring. I was a preacher's kid. We lived in a glass house. I didn't get in trouble. Part of it was not my nature to get in trouble. And the other part of it was I knew everybody in that little town would hear about it if I did. I didn't want that. But there came a point in my life when I was in my teenage years that I had to make the decision for Jesus to not only be my Savior, but to be the owner, the Lord of my life. And I'm not going to burn the last minute and a half here with the details about that, but I guess the point I'm making is the changes that it made in my life were at that time not dramatic. But now, at age 70, the aggregate change in my life, well, first of all, I'm not done with those changes. God is changing me daily, often moment to moment. Tell your story. Think it through. And be able to tell it. And then the last thing about telling your story is you got to have a spine if you're going to tell your story. Especially if you're like me. Introverts will find this much more difficult than extroverts. Gulp down some courage and tell your story. Okay, I'll see you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.